I never expected my life to change with a single knock on the door. But there he was. My nephew, now a grown man, standing there with piercing eyes and an easy smile. I felt a strange flutter in my chest as memories of my youth resurfaced. I tried to brush it off, but the way he looked at me lingered. That night, everything I thought I knew began to unravel. Emily had always been the dependable one in the family, the aunt who showed up to birthday parties with thoughtful gifts and warm hugs. At 38, she had built a comfortable life for herself. Her home was cozy, filled with carefully chosen furniture and pictures from happier times. But lately, she had started to feel the cracks in her seemingly perfect world. Her divorce 3 years ago had left her lonely, even though she tried to convince herself otherwise. Emily buried herself in work and hobbies, avoiding the quiet moments where doubt and regret crept in. She missed the days when she felt beautiful, desired, and full of life. That morning, as she rummaged through her closet, she found a forgotten relic of her past, a tight, red mini-skirt. It had been years since she dared to wear something so bold. She held it up, memories of her carefree younger self rushing back. Against her better judgment, she slipped it on and looked in the mirror. The reflection startled her. She looked alive. Just then, a knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find Nick, her 22-year-old nephew, standing there with a toolbox and an easy grin. "Hey, Aunt Emily. You called about the leaky faucet." Nick had always been the sweet, dependable nephew who helped around the house. But today, something about him felt different. He wasn't the boy she remembered. He had grown into a confident man with broad shoulders and a charm that made her suddenly self-conscious. As he walked inside, Emily couldn't shake the sudden awareness of her appearance. She tried to laugh it off, focusing on the faucet issue, but every time their eyes met, an unspoken tension simmered. Nick was cheerful as always, talking about his job, his gym routine, and his weekend plans. Emily listened, but her mind wandered. She noticed the way he moved, the strength in his arms, and the ease of his laughter. For the first time, she saw him in a different light, and that scared her. She brushed the feelings aside, convincing herself they were silly. But as the day went on, that fear lingered, and Emily couldn't shake the sense that something was about to change forever. Emily tried to push aside the unsettling thoughts that had crept into her mind. After all, Nick was family, her nephew. She kept telling herself that the sudden awareness she felt around him was nothing more than misplaced nostalgia. But the way he looked at her lingered in her mind long after he had left the room. Later that afternoon, as Emily prepared coffee, Nick called her into the bathroom where he was fixing the faucet. "Can you hold this for a second?" he asked, flashing her a grin. She knelt beside him, holding the tool he pointed at, but the space between them felt far too small. She was suddenly aware of how close his arm brushed against hers and the faint scent of his cologne. Her heartbeat quickened, and she scolded herself for noticing such details. "You've been quiet lately," Nick said, glancing up at her. "You used to laugh all the time. What's been going on?" His words caught her off guard. She didn't know whether to feel comforted or exposed by his observation. "Oh, she replied nervously, "life has a way of keeping you on your toes." Nick tilted his head, studying her expression. "Well, you shouldn't let it steal your spark. I've always looked up to you. You're the strongest person I know." Emily felt warmth at his words, but also a strange sense of guilt. She quickly changed the subject, asking about his work and friends. Nick obliged, sharing stories that made her smile, but the undercurrent of tension remained. When the faucet was fixed, Nick washed up and prepared to leave. Before stepping out, he turned and said, "You looked really happy today, Aunt Emily. It suits you." His words stayed with her long after he left. That night, Emily found herself replaying the moments they shared. The way his eyes lingered a little too long, the way his hand brushed against hers as he handed her a wrench. She hated herself for even thinking about it, but the thoughts wouldn't go away. Then came the note. Emily found it slipped under her door late that evening. Her heart pounded as she unfolded it, instantly recognizing Nick's handwriting. "Aunt Emily, I know this may be wrong, but I can't stop thinking about you. If you feel the same, say nothing. But if you don't, I'll never bring it up again." Her hands trembled. Anger, disbelief, and something far more dangerous swirled inside her. She knew what she needed to do: tear up the note and shut this down. But instead, she folded it neatly and placed it in her drawer. The next day, Nick texted her. "Did you get my note?" Emily's hands hovered over the keyboard. She wanted to put an end to this, but her reply came out softer than intended. "Nick, this isn't right. We can't." His response came immediately. "I just need to know." Do you feel anything at all? Emily stared at her phone, unsure of what was more terrifying, the fact that he had asked or the fact that she didn't immediately say no. Emily couldn't focus on anything after Nick's text. She knew she should shut this down completely, but her hesitation lingered, filling her with guilt and confusion. She reminded herself over and over, Nick was family. Yet his words echoed in her mind, stirring emotions she hadn't felt in years. The following evening, Nick showed up unexpectedly. Emily opened the door, her pulse quickening as she saw him standing there, hands in his pockets and eyes filled with unspoken tension. I just needed to talk, he said, his voice low. Emily stepped aside, letting him in despite her better judgment. Nick, this has to stop, she said firmly, but her voice wavered. Then tell me you feel nothing, he replied, stepping closer. Look me in the eyes and tell me. Emily froze. She wanted to say it, to end this once and for all. But when she met his gaze, the words wouldn't come. Instead, her breath hitched as Nick reached out, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. This isn't right, she whispered, but she didn't move away. I know, he murmured, his fingers lingering against her cheek. But I can't stop thinking about you. Emily's body betrayed her. She felt the heat of his touch, and the longing she had buried for so long bubbling to the surface. Before she could process what was happening, Nick leaned in closer. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Emily's heart raced as she felt his breath on her lips, but then reality came crashing down. She stepped back abruptly. This has to stop, she said, more to herself than to him. Nick, I'm serious. Nick looked at her with pleading eyes. I'm sorry, he said. I didn't mean to push you, but I can't pretend I don't feel this way. Emily struggled to catch her breath. She wanted to scream at him, push him away, but part of her didn't want him to leave. Instead, she said, you need to go. Now. Nick hesitated but finally nodded and walked out, leaving Emily trembling in the living room. That night, Emily tossed and turned in bed, unable to sleep. Her phone vibrated. A text. I'm sorry if I made things worse. I just can't pretend anymore. I'll stay away if that's what you want. Tears welled up in Emily's eyes as she typed back, we can't do this, Nick. It's wrong. But even as she sent the message, her heart ached. She couldn't deny that Nick's attention made her feel alive, something she hadn't felt in years. The next morning, Emily tried to distract herself with work, but the weight of what had happened lingered. She looked out the window and saw Nick standing on the sidewalk, staring up at her house. She went outside. Nick, what are you doing here? I needed to see you, he said. I needed to know if you're okay. Emily's defenses crumbled. She let him inside again, telling herself it was just to talk, to set boundaries. But as the evening unfolded, their conversations grew deeper. Nick opened up about his loneliness and how he had always admired her strength. Emily, in turn, confessed how lost she had felt since her divorce. The emotional walls between them shattered, leaving them vulnerable. At one point, Nick reached for her hand, and this time, Emily didn't pull away. I don't know how we got here, she said softly, tears in her eyes. Neither do I, Nick replied. But I can't ignore it. Their hands lingered together, and Emily felt herself leaning into him, drawn by a force she couldn't resist. She knew this path could only lead to disaster, yet she couldn't bring herself to break the connection. The room was thick with tension as Nick gently cupped her face. Emily closed her eyes, torn between desire and guilt. But before anything more could happen, the shrill ring of her phone shattered the moment. She pulled away and answered it. Her heart sank as she heard the voice on the other end. Nick's been in an accident. He's in the hospital. Emily's world tilted. Everything she had been struggling to suppress came rushing back in an overwhelming wave of panic and regret. Emily's hands shook as she gripped the phone, the words echoing in her ears. Nick was in the hospital. She didn't even remember grabbing her keys or locking the door. All she knew was that she had to get to him. Her mind raced as she drove through the rain-soaked streets. Was this her fault? Had her hesitation, her mixed signals, driven him to this? She hated herself for letting things get so complicated, for not stopping it sooner. When she arrived at the hospital, her heart dropped. The sterile smell and harsh fluorescent lights made the situation feel even more surreal. She ran to the front desk. Nick Dawson. Where is he? She gasped. The nurse gave her a concerned look. He's in the ICU. Second floor. Emily's legs felt like lead as she climbed the stairs, dread tightening in her chest with every step. She found his room and froze at the sight. Nick was lying there, his face pale and bruised, a bandage wrapped around his forehead. Wires and monitors beeped around him, and for a moment, Emily couldn't breathe. Nick, she whispered, stepping closer. His eyes fluttered open, and when he saw her, he managed a weak smile. "You came." "Of course I did," she said, tears spilling down her cheeks. "What happened?" Nick winced, his voice barely above a whisper. "I wasn't paying attention. I ran a red light." Emily's guilt hit her like a tidal wave. Was he distracted because of her? Because of the tension and confusion she had let fester between them? "This is my fault," she said, her voice cracking. "No," Nick said firmly, even in his weakened state. "It's not. Don't blame yourself for what I feel." Emily sat down beside him, taking his hand in hers. "Nick, this has to stop. We can't do this. It's not right." He looked at her, pain flickering in his eyes, not from his injuries but from her words. "I know," he said finally. "But it doesn't change how I feel." Emily felt her resolve breaking again, but she knew this was the moment to end it, for both their sakes. "You need to let me go, Nick. And I need to let you go." His hand tightened around hers. "Do you really want that?" Tears streamed down her face as she nodded. "Yes. It's the only way." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with unspoken words and shattered hopes. Emily stood up, brushing her hand gently across his forehead. "Focus on getting better, Nick. That's what matters now." She turned and walked out, each step feeling like it was breaking her apart. But it wasn't over. A week later, Emily received a message, this time from Nick's mother, her sister. Nick was being released from the hospital, but he had asked to see Emily before going home. Against her better judgment, she agreed. When she arrived at the hospital, Nick was sitting on the edge of the bed, looking stronger but still carrying the weight of everything that had happened. "I wanted to say goodbye," he said softly. Emily's heart clenched, but she forced herself to smile. "Goodbye doesn't mean forever. It just means we both need time to heal." Nick reached into his bag and handed her a folded note. "I wrote this before the accident. I wasn't sure if I'd ever give it to you." Emily hesitated before opening it. "Emily, I know this has been messy and complicated, but I don't regret any of it. You made me feel alive in ways I can't explain. I'll always care about you, but I'll respect your decision, whatever it is." Tears blurred her vision as she folded the note and looked up at him. "You'll always be important to me, Nick. But we have to let this go." Nick nodded, but she could see the sadness in his eyes. "I'll try." Emily left the hospital that day knowing they had crossed lines that could never be uncrossed. The tension, the guilt, the longing, it would all take time to fade. But she also knew they had survived it, even if it left scars. The days after Nick's release from the hospital were some of the hardest Emily had ever faced. She thought distancing herself would bring clarity, but instead, it only deepened the ache inside her. She found herself staring at her phone, fighting the urge to check if he had messaged her. But he hadn't, not since their goodbye. Emily buried herself in work, trying to forget the way Nick had looked at her in that hospital room. The pain, the longing, the sadness. She convinced herself that staying apart was for the best. And yet the guilt lingered, heavy and suffocating. Her sister called one evening, casually mentioning Nick. "He's been quiet lately. More serious. I think the accident shook him up." Emily forced a smile through the phone. "I'm sure he just needs time. He'll be okay." But deep down she wasn't so sure. A week later, Emily spotted Nick unexpectedly at the grocery store. He was pushing a cart down the aisle, his eyes tired but focused. Her heart leaped into her throat. She considered turning around before he saw her, but it was too late. Their eyes met. Nick froze for a moment, then gave her a hesitant smile. Emily's feet felt glued to the floor as he approached. "Hey," he said softly. "Hi," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. For a moment they just stood there, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between them. Finally, Nick broke the silence. "How have you been?" Emily swallowed hard. "I've been okay. And you?" He nodded, but the sadness in his eyes betrayed him. "I'm getting there." An awkward silence followed, and Emily knew she had to be the one to end it. "Nick, Before she could finish, he interrupted her. "I know. You don't have to say it again." His words stung, but she forced herself to smile. "I'm glad you're doing better." Nick nodded and stepped back. "Take care of yourself, Emily." She watched him walk away, each step feeling like another goodbye. That night, Emily sat alone in her living room, staring at the skirt that had started everything. She wanted to throw it away, to erase the memories tied to it, but she couldn't. Instead, she folded it neatly and packed it away, as if hiding it could make the feelings disappear. The weeks turned into months, and slowly, Emily began to heal. She focused on herself, attending therapy to work through the guilt and confusion. She learned to forgive herself, not for feeling something she couldn't control, but for letting it linger too long. As for Nick, he eventually moved away for a new job, putting physical distance between them. Emily heard updates through her sister. How he was thriving, meeting new people, and moving forward with his life. It hurt, but it also brought relief. Knowing he was okay gave her the peace she had been searching for. One evening, months later, Emily received a letter. Her hands trembled as she opened it, recognizing Nick's handwriting immediately. "Emily, I wanted to thank you for everything. For being there when I needed someone the most, and for helping me find the strength to move on. I'll always care about you, but I know now that we both needed space to heal. I hope you're finding your happiness too. Nick." Tears streamed down Emily's face as she folded the letter. For the first time, she felt closure, not just with Nick, but with herself. She stepped outside, breathing in the crisp evening air. The past would always be a part of her, but it no longer defined her. She had faced her mistakes, learned from them, and now, she was ready to move forward. Emily sat on her porch, gazing at the fading sunset as the last rays of light dipped below the horizon. The world felt calmer now, quieter, as if the storm she had weathered over the past months had finally passed. But the scars it left behind lingered, faint reminders of a chapter she would never forget. She had spent countless nights replaying every moment, Nick's words, his touch, the way his eyes had pleaded for something she could never give. But time had softened those memories, turning them into lessons instead of regrets. In therapy, Emily had learned to confront the loneliness that had made her vulnerable. She realized that Nick wasn't the real source of her turmoil. He had only reflected back the parts of herself she had buried. The longing for connection, for validation, for feeling alive again after years of heartbreak. But what she had also learned was that boundaries mattered. Love without limits could destroy even the strongest bonds. It was a painful lesson, but one she would carry forward. One evening, Emily visited her sister's house for dinner. Nick wasn't there. He had moved to another city, chasing a fresh start. She listened as her sister talked about how proud she was of him, how he had turned his life around after the accident. Emily smiled, genuinely happy for him. She had feared that their story would end in tragedy, but instead, it had been a catalyst for growth, for both of them. As she drove home that night, Emily glanced at her reflection in the rearview mirror. She looked stronger now, more sure of herself. She had faced temptation, heartbreak, and guilt, and come out the other side wiser and more grounded. Her phone buzzed as she pulled into her driveway. It was a text from Nick. "Thank you, Emily. For everything." She stared at the words for a moment, then typed back. "Be happy, Nick. You deserve it." With a deep breath, Emily stepped inside her home, ready to close this chapter for good. She knew the journey hadn't been easy, but she had emerged from it with a clearer understanding of herself and what she wanted from life. Her story wasn't about forbidden love. It was about rediscovering self-respect, boundaries, and the courage to let go of something that could never be right. As she turned off the lights and climbed into bed, Emily whispered to herself, "Never again." And this time she meant it. If you were in Emily's position, what would you have done? Would you have shut the door immediately, or let emotions take over? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more gripping stories like this one. You won't believe what's coming next. Stay tuned for another shocking tale of secrets, betrayals, and forbidden emotions.